There we are. Intrigue Podcast, Ryan Ray, and the good doctor herself, Dr. Ellen Wald. How you doing, Miss Wald?
Hey, it is great now that it's stopped raining here.
Well, it's a beautiful day in Texas, so I can't complain. It is nice and cool. Slight breeze. I didn't not give the weather forecast, but enjoying the weather here today in the great state of Texas. Um, Dr. Wald, we do have a guest coming on, and Dean Foreman will be on next week for his regular scheduled show. So, okay, well, let's get into it because we have a handful of things to cover today before our guest gets here. Blackout hits Iran nuclear site in what appears to be Israeli sabotage. Um,
Whoa.
it feels like every time something happens in Iran, like it's the Israelis or the first ones that are blamed, whether they did it or not. I'm not trying to take a stance on this, but it's like that's like this they have like the standard copy PR, and it's like Israeli was attacked. I mean, Iran was attacked by Israeli. Insert whatever it was here, and so it's like they have that their press release ready to go. So, big deal, not big deal. What you think, Miss Wald?
So it's interesting. So a couple interesting things about this, which I've kind of been following over the weekend. So apparently they think that this was a cyber attack which caused the power to go out. But then they're saying that they found, at least Iran, I think, was saying that they found the person who's somewhat responsible, which would indicate it was person. And so then I saw people saying, well, actually, it's that it probably was this cyber attack was probably delivered on a USB stick, meaning a person had to do it, which is totally spy.
Bond, yeah.
Yeah, James Bond, spy stuff, which is just super interesting to those of us who are into spy stuff. But what I think is most interesting is that at least the way I read this is coming right after that meeting that happened last week with between the U.S. Well, I don't think they were actually meeting face to face, but through intermediaries. But the U.S. delegation and the Iranian delegation, and basically the U.S. was well, let's talk, and Iran was okay, so get rid of all of the sanctions, and he was well, not really. Let's discuss. We can commit to getting rid of some of the non-nuclear focused sanctions, basically everyone's interpreting this very differently because if you interpret it one way, it could mean oh, they're suddenly going to just get rid of all the oil sanctions, and other people are well, that doesn't actually mean that. But I think that this was a message that Israel is sending to the US. Actually, I don't think this had that much to do with I think they're showing yeah, we can attack Iran in these whenever we want, but also they're sending a message to the Americans, which is don't do this. We don't like what you were just doing. Don't just give away what is that phrase? Give away the horse with the barn, or I don't know. But don't just give everything away. And so I think that I think that's the only way to read it, honestly, in my mind, is that this is a message to the Biden administration.
Interesting. So, what is the relationship between Netanyahu and Biden?
I would say it's probably not good. I mean, I don't think that Netanyahu had a great relationship with, I'd say, barely certain people in the Trump administration. I don't know if Netanyahu himself and Trump had a great relationship, but they certainly talked a good talk. With all the Trump moving the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem, and then some other countries following suit. I think that definitely made things good. I think that the Biden administration definitely doesn't have so much of a relationship with Netanyahu. I don't think it's actively bad like it was at the end with Obama. What's interesting though is Netanyahu is they just had another election in Israel, right, which was basically inconclusive again. And so the way it works there is that they have their parliamentary elections. They have the election, and then the president basically says, okay, usually the winner of the election, they say, okay, you go form a government. But it was basically, similarly inconclusive to all these previous elections that they've had, but he gave Netanyahu the go ahead to say, go try to form a government. So technically, that's what they're in the middle of right now. They're still trying to form a new government. And it's unclear what's going to come of that. But Netanyahu seems to still be running the show.
So this is what and I was on the remind me at the end of the podcast. I'll plug the shows on, but we're talking about the U.S. sanctions and China and Iran, and if you want to push the Iranians into China's hands like all the way, whatever distance they're keeping now, if there's any, like we're continuing to push these countries towards China, and whatever you think, if you're a hawkish person on China and you're afraid of China's rise to dominance and all this stuff, aren't you just playing into their hands with these type of actions? Because if you're telling the U.S. don't work with Iran, well, they're going to continue to work with China, and so wouldn't you, if you're Israel, wouldn't you prefer that the Iranians work with the U.S. compared to China? Because China don't care.
Yeah, I think that they see Iran as such an existential threat, like such a threat to their very existence, that they're not willing to like let any quarter go. And
But they're not
like they
stopping the
don't.
China though. That's the thing. So that's what I'm saying. So they're not stopping them and the Chinese from doing anything.
Yeah.
So your options are you can push them to China. I'm not saying that they're going to welcome the U.S. with open arms, but if your read on this is right, then you're saying we don't want the U.S. to deal with them. Well, that just makes them work with China more, and I don't know how that helps the Israelis.
I think that Israel is very firmly in the. If we're going to divide the world, U.S. is in the Israel's in the U.S. camp.
Sure.
I mean, that's where they get all their military technology from. Like that's it for them. And so their idea is the best course of action is for the U.S. and therefore the West to try to freeze Iran out. I mean, I think Israel would like to see the end of this Iranian regime, and that they see this as the best way to go about that. I don't think that I don't like, for example, I don't think that the Gulf countries, and Saudi Arabia, who kind of join with Israel on this issue, I don't think that they might say that they'd like to see the end of the Iranian regime, but I don't think that that's actually in their interests at all. And I don't think they actually want the end of this Iranian regime, because it would pose all sorts of other issues for them that they don't want to deal with. Israel doesn't have those issues, being a democratic Jewish country.
Right. Yeah, I don't know. I just think that if you let's just for the sake of argument say that China is a true superpower today. That's something that you have to deal with. Well, if you're pushing these unstable regimes or totalitarian regimes into their arms, I don't know how that's. I just don't know how that's a good thing. And it feels like this is very much old school geopolitical thinking that doesn't actually do anything. It draws the lines harder, and I mean, I would suspect that what you want, if you're the Israelis or anyone, is for the Iranian people to become somewhat more wealthy, because they're extremely poor now, but somewhat wealthy, relatively speaking, so that there is an actual threat to the government to not do bad deals. Right now, what I mean, there's no real impetus for the government to do much because they have complete control. They claim they're protecting them from the Israelis, from the Americans. So I don't know. I understand Israel's concern that you can't trust them, but you're just pushing them to China's hands. I don't know how that ultimately plays out well for you.
I think from Israel's perspective, they don't really care, honestly. Like,
Right,
I don't think
right.
that's a concern for them. I think that with what could be interesting is like, I mean, what are Israel's dealings with China in this sense? And I think Israel is of the opinion that like those are lesser tier areas. Like,
Yeah.
fine, let the Iranians and the Chinese do all that they want, because like we're with the Americans, and that's where the real things are happening.
Yeah, it's just weird.
Which may be short-sighted.
Yeah, well, it's weird because when you look at the China stuff, there's a lot of fear mongering about what China might be, what they might become. Some of it's probably more realized than others. But then you see stuff like this, like, okay, they have to think through these things, and so maybe you're right. Maybe they just think that the American side is the better angle. To me, it would seem just to push back on the Chinese, to push back on China is quite easier, or is easier in this spot. Maybe it's easier to work with Chinese. Maybe it's that easy to work with Chinese as it seems to be. Not that easy. I think, as we said, I don't know. Yeah, if the Iranians, I think what I'm trying to say, Manu, is if the Iranians are working with the Chinese, then they are becoming, yeah, not Sweden. So yeah, yeah. Well, the Iranians will sign a 25-year deal with them. That's what they just signed. 25, 30-year deal.
For like what though? That's the thing. Let's talk about like, okay, so like, what's so say we're developing, we're almost like developing, like with the Soviet Union, we had like we had the Eastern Bloc, and they all did business with each other, and we had the Western Bloc, and they all did business with each other. Although really, as we learned from the World for Sale, actually there was a lot of these commodity dealings going on between the Eastern Bloc and the Western Bloc that were unofficial and deals for grain. So it wasn't totally shut off, but in general it was. But okay, but so say you've got like the Chinese sphere and the other people sphere, which isn't really valid because like the US and China do tons of business. But okay, so you've got Iran and Venezuela who do business with China. And it's basically like you've got like the not reject nations, that's not really nice. The like nations that are under US sanctions who go and do business with China. So that's Iran, Venezuela, North Korea, and Cuba, I guess. In the grand scheme of things, if you're Israel and you're like, okay, well, if I have to pick one, which I don't think they do because they can still do business with China, like, does it really matter that they're not doing business with like Cuba and Venezuela? I don't think so. So it's like, I kind of feel like China's like picking the dregs. There may be a lot of money to be made there, but like, does it really matter?
Well, okay, and this goes to a point is if your argument is that the Chinese are these great long linear thinkers and they are playing 6D chess and we're not even playing checkers over here, we're playing tic-tac-toe. Okay, then you have to think that what they're doing is they're picking up these poor nations who are under sanctions and they're going to convert them to their currency. So they're taking a run at the reserve currency, which the Israelis and all the US allies would not want to happen. But they're starting from the bottom up, right? They're starting from the bottom up. And oh, by the way, if they're using their digital yuan, then they can track their citizens, which would increase the totalitarianism in these nation states. And they're going to work their way up from bottom up, right? And so they might go to somewhere like Kenya right now, was going through a civil war, or some place like that. So then all of a sudden, or the Sudan, or the Congo. Well, next thing you know, you start getting to Africa, where these nations are cross-border trading a lot. Well, then it flips over there. So if you're thinking that they are these big long linear planners, then that's what you would suspect they're doing. So pushing the Iranians towards them would seem to help what they're wanting to do. And that's why I struggle with: do people really believe the narrative that China is the big bad threat that they say it is, or do the Israelis' actions and the U.S. actions tell us that maybe they're not? Maybe it's more of fear mongering than it is actual fear. You're muted. You're muted.
Sorry. I think it's actually a lot more fear mongering than fear in some respects. I do think for the Israelis really are afraid that Iran is going to nuke them. But I do think it's an interesting. I think that if people aren't watching what China is doing in Iran and what China is doing in certain places in Africa, then that's going to be at a huge disadvantage, because you need to keep an eye, to really look and analyze what exactly they're doing and how that fits in. Because you can say like, okay, so whatever, if they have Iran, who cares? They have Venezuela, or they have,
right?
But like, that's, is this the domino theory again?
Right.
Remember that, like in the Cold War, like you can't let anything, like, oh my God, if like Vietnam falls, then you've lost all of East Asia in the, domino. So I don't know.
Yeah.
Is Cold War strategy come back? We're gonna have to resurrect, Kennan and company.
Yeah, and Manu, I don't know. The other day we were talking about the digital you want offline. I don't know if I gave you the paper or not. That I was. No, I didn't. If you shoot me a DM, I'll send you, Manu, the digital yuan paper that I've been going through here recently, and you can go check that out. And I don't, if we can link to it in the show notes, we will. But I don't know if we can or not. But anyways, it's a PDF.
I just say one other interesting thing about the digital yuan. So what's one of the interesting things that I've learned about Iran, I haven't visited there myself, but they didn't really have like credit card payments. Like you can't use that system there. Like you just can't, because they've been kind of frozen out of all that stuff. So it'd be very interesting if, say, like they're able to introduce this into their population via China.
Well, if they have the cell phones and they use Huawei, because like when I was in China, if you held up your hand for a taxi and you held out cash, they wouldn't take it. They wanted the WeChat Pay or Alibaba Pay or whatever it was.
Wow.
They didn't want the I'm not saying that you couldn't use cash here in China, but if you want to get taxi, they want it coming from your phone to their phone instant. So if the Iranians have smartphones, then that would be one way to roll it out.
There you go.
Okay, I'm on the wrong screen here. Okay, let me clear my throat. There we go. Total. I'm too many screens here. Total signs key deal for Uganda's Lake Albert project. Total said today, this would have been on the 12th, that first crude exports from the long-delayed Lake Albert project are planned for 2025. Ooh, okay. Well.
That's actually not that far away. That's only like 4 years.
Oh God, it is.
I know. I know. I just looked up George Kennan because I was like, I think I remember he's still alive. If he's still alive, okay, he was still alive when like I was in college and I was like writing my, I was like looking up policy for my senior thesis. I was like, oh my God, it's 2003 and George Kennan's still alive. Well, he died in 2005 and I'm thinking he's still alive. Like, he would be like the oldest man alive if he was still alive.
Yeah, I really think last year was like a time warp, and so it's really like it's got us all screwed up. You're right; it's less than 5 years away. That's crazy. Because I was like, when I read the headline, I'm like, oh God, this is like 8 years away. Nope.
Well, wait till you think about the sunset provisions on the JCPOA. Since we were just talking about Iran, like remember those sunset? Were like when the JCPOA comes out, and it was like, so fine. Like in the 15 years, they can like none of the supplies anymore, and they can get the bomb, and like we'll all be whatever in a different world with flying cars. Well, it's 2021. It's not that far away anymore.
Wow. No, yeah. Time flies.
Anyway,
it stood still last year. It's flying now. Okay.
Yeah.
So what's your read on this?
So I thought it was interesting because look who's developing this field in Uganda and Tanzania, Total and CNOOC, Chinese National Oil Company. So like you were saying, so this is Africa. Who's developing Africa's oil resources right now? So you've got, you've got like certain people are in Nigeria, certain Angola, Guyana, but what are the new deals? Do you think that is BP going to go in and develop this stuff? Is, Total still wants to go around the world and develop this stuff? Great. Who do they have to work with? You're not going to be seeing them working with like, Shell or BP or maybe not even Chevron, maybe Exxon, maybe. But these firms have like totally changed their tune and they want to invest in like wind farms. Well, Africa wants to develop its oil resources. And so I have a feeling that we're going to see a lot more deals between, these firms and Chinese firms and Russian firms. And what would be really interesting and what I kind of love to see is, some of like the Middle Eastern national oil companies getting into this. Right now they just develop their own resources, but they have a lot of know-how and technology and things. I'm just saying I don't think it would be out of the question to see at some point in the next 5 years to see them going abroad and doing development work in other areas, just especially as some of these Western firms are pulling back.
So let me get your take on this. The book, Billions at Play, maybe? Let's see here. I think it's Billions at Play. Anyways, Billions at Play. And he argues that Africa, the various African nations, should join OPEC.
Well, a lot of them have. Look at all the new additions. They've got Sudan and South Sudan, and these are not big oil producers. They are gonna they don't get much say in OPEC, and yet they're still joining.
Well, so his argument was interesting. He was saying that the benefit for these African nations would be they would have access to the data.
Yeah.
And so that would be worth them having to deal with.
It's not just data. I think I think that is a huge benefit. I think that's a benefit that isn't talked about enough when it comes to OPEC, which is that you get to have you get the opportunity to have close relationships with these mega oil producers. You get not that they're just like opening up their doors and saying, here, come take our info, but you get prime access to these people, and that can lead to plans and deals and expertise and all sorts of things. So it's you got to pay, you got to sit around while they're like, okay, everybody cut 10%, and you're like, oh well, like that's like a lot of money for me, my tiny African country. But on the other hand, it could pay off.
Yeah. So, anyways, okay, let's see here. We have a few minutes before our guest comes on, so let's keep going. Higher gasoline margins may cut China's fuel oil output. Gasoline prices are going up still, right? How much higher are they going to go?
I don't know. It's going to be the summer. They generally go higher in the summer. I think they're going to go higher. I think with the fact that we're not seeing increases in U.S. oil production, that gasoline prices should increase this summer. I think that's a given. They're going to go up. This is supposed to be a huge driving summer because apparently everyone wants to go out, but no one wants to fly. No one wants to leave the country. So where are they going to go? They're going to drive.
I mean, seriously. I mean, you can, I guess, but I mean, like, it's. Do you have to quarantine? I don't know what the rules are. Like, do you have to quarantine if you have the vaccine or not? Or I'm genuinely asking.
No one knows. I don't know. Nobody knows what the rules are. No one's making the rules. Like, I think the rules are different in a lot of places, and no one's actually like gotten around. I mean, I know people are traveling, but I think it's like mostly business. Although I don't know. I really don't know. But I do think that I think that we're definitely not going to see domestic airlines are preparing for big increases. I know that. But what's interesting about this article is more to do with like the question is, so apparently they're doing maintenance in Chinese refineries, and so but the question was, so it says higher fuel output in March may have reduced China's fuel imports in April, et cetera, et cetera. I think the question is like, is China going to continue importing a lot of oil that it then turns into products and then sells around Asia? And at what point is prices going to get high enough that they're going to stop doing that? Or the margins going to dictate that they kind of calm down on this? And that could be a problem for OPEC and Russia.
Oil prices aren't high though. That's the thing.
Yeah.
I mean, so Brent's at 63 right now. WTI's at 59. It's not like we're talking about $85 oil. It's high 50s, low 60s.
Yeah, well, except like Goldman Sachs still thinks that we're going to have $80 oil this summer, which is only like 2 months away. So
super cycle. Is the super cycle dead, or are we still in the super cycle? I haven't heard.
I think
that was like the buzzword, like 3 weeks ago. It was like super cycle. And it's like, okay, a little aggressive there, guys.
I wasn't really sure what was so super about it, but
so I don't know if the super cycle is still going on or if we've done that. So are they still calling for? Is Goldman still calling for 80 in the summer?
I think so. Hey, I wasn't the one making that call, but I think they are. I mean, I don't think OPEC has increased production all that much. But one of the interesting things in the next article about Saudi Arabia meeting its May crude supply for most Asian buyers is interesting because they are increasing production a bit, but India is not happy, and India state refiners cut their request for Saudi oil by 36% in May, which is not insignificant because Middle East oil is like India I think I wrote about this actually in my investing.com column last week. India buys a huge amount of Middle Eastern oil for like the percentage of oil that it buys. Iraq is slightly higher than Saudi Arabia, but there's like huge benefits to buying oil from the Persian Gulf because it takes almost no time to get to India. And the fact that India is now going and they're buying from Brazil, they're buying from the US, they're buying from Norway, they're buying from Guyana. I think they're making a statement that they don't consider the Saudis so reliable basically because of what's been going on in OPEC, because of this back and forth, or we're going to cut now a million barrels a day, something. And I think that's a message that they're sending, which is, we're willing to pay more to expand our options because we don't like the way you're treating us. The customer strikes back. It's like if oil was like if they give like a Yelp review, like write their Yelp reviews.
Yeah, but see, this is the thing. But China's going to buy from whoever they want to buy from, though, right?
Yeah, and China and Saudi have like long-term contracts. So Saudi is going to fulfill its long-term contracts with China. We're talking about the spot, like beyond their long-term contracts. What is it that they're buying? And so basically, they're able to meet the demand in some respects because India is like, we're not going to buy so much. So
Well,
it
we
looks
should
better
see.
than it is. Yeah.
I mean, when you look at the economic data, it feels like I don't know if we talked about this on this show or not, but last I guess it was last week I saw it, maybe 2 weeks ago. The CDC. Did we talk about the CDC extending the eviction moratorium for rentals?
I don't know. I've talked
That's
about that with other people.
so they extended it to June. Well, that's obviously a sign that the economy's got some pretty glaring holes from their perspective. Because people can't pay the
Yeah.
rent, and so yeah. So I don't know. So 80 super cycle 8-hour old. We'll see.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. How many
So,
people are going on vacation if they can't afford their rent?
well, that's even the real question is can they not afford it, or are they not paying it because they can't get evicted? So
Yeah.
there's all kinds of questions.
Yeah, that's a good point.
But I think plenty can't afford it, but we'll see. Okay, Saudi Arabia meets May crude supply for
No, we talked
most
about that.
Asia buyer. Oh, sorry.
I just talked about that.
I'm sorry. Yep,
It's
yep.
okay. I kind of added it into the
Yeah, I'm
previous
on my
piece.
Ron Burgundy. It's on the teleprompter, so I'm just going down it there. Uh-oh. Oh, God. Tesla set to attack and conquer $1 trillion energy market.
Yeah, I thought this was interesting because the argument is like, well, kind of like how Apple has its like ecosystem of stuff and like, Amazon is like a whole ecosystem. Could Tesla be the next like ecosystem of products for energy storage? And I'm not convinced, but I thought it was an interesting way to look at it.
Well, they're drilling wells down here in Texas, right? Or they're going to.
Yeah, then they're going to run the oil through some sort of like thing to convert it to like battery power. Because I have this feeling it's like people think that like, oh, as long as it comes from the power plant or like comes through the wall, it must be cleaner than if it like comes through a pipe, right? And that is not necessarily correct. But people have this idea that like, oh, if we just like convert all the natural gas heating to to electric heat pumps or something, then like it'll be clean. As opposed to thinking, well, when you eliminate natural gas directly for heating and you put all of that load onto the power grid and the power plants, when there's a problem, they're going to shift to coal. It's like it's like, well, but then the power plants will just run off of renewables. Like it's so short-sighted. It's like out of sight, out of mind kind of thing. Like if we don't see that, if there's no pipeline delivering it, then it must be clean because it could be clean.
It's a good argument. I like that argument. It works for me.
Yeah. There we go. As long as it looks like it could be clean, then it is clean.
Well, I mean, if you think about it, if what's hear no evil, see no evil.
Yeah.
You see no pipeline, taste no pipeline.
Yeah. Who cares if it's like your electricity goes out in the middle of the winter because we couldn't get enough natural gas, or who cares if that power plant 30 miles away is belching coal.
Oh gracious. Yeah, I don't know. What do you think about the Tesla stuff with China? Have you followed much of that?
Well, I heard they're trying to make Teslas there, and they like want to own part of their factory or something like that. I don't know.
Well, China's accusing them of spying on their stuff, and so it's
right, spying.
It's not everyone lets them get away with whatever they want to. So okay, let's see here. Our guest is here, I believe. Can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
Very good. Very good. Good. Loud and clear. Why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself to our listeners and we'll get into it.
Sure. I'm Grant Strem, the CEO of Proton Technologies, and my background's geology and engineering, and I have a process for making extremely low-cost hydrogen from oil fields while also burying huge volumes of CO2 into them at low cost. So happy to talk about that or broad trends as well. Pleased to be invited and pleased to meet you both, Dr. Energy and Ryan Ray.
Well, let's talk about hydrogen. So Ellen and I were talking before we got on. Not really hydrogen experts, so it's kind of good for us to kind of get educated here. So so feel free to talk to me like I'm a small 3-year-old and explain this to me. But my understanding that I've kind of, from what I've read of hydrogen, is it's kind of an expensive energy source, but it's abundant. Or is that a misnomer? Is that true? Am I missing something? Kind of maybe break down some of the misconceptions around hydrogen. I can't say the word hydrogen in general.
Sure. I think there's sort of a bad taste because there was a technology push a couple of times in the past where people had an end use for hydrogen in mind and thought that it would just take over. But what was missing at that time was an abundance of low-cost hydrogen. There was small volumes. The tricky part is we get our hydrogen from water, and water has extremely strong bonds, and you need to do something energetic to break those bonds and get the hydrogen separated from the oxygen. So H2O, the H is hydrogen, the O is oxygen. And if you want to separate them from each other, you need either a lot of electricity for something like electrolysis, or a high temperature chemical reaction of some kind, such as how most hydrogen is made today. So as an industrial process, it's been quite common, and there's been a significant shift towards focusing on the production of hydrogen, and not only just the production of hydrogen, but the clean and carbon-free production of hydrogen. So one thing about electrolysis is if you have wind and solar, for example, powering your electrolysis device, you can do it where there's no direct carbon emissions. Of course, everything has original carbon intensity. If you look at the steel and the concrete and everything that's needed to build these capacity. But traditionally, hydrogen has either been relatively low cost, but with a huge carbon footprint, or relatively high cost with a relatively smaller carbon footprint. So it's only recently that companies such as mine are trying to offer solutions that address both of these issues. It can be used, hydrogen can be used for just about any type of system that we currently use either electricity for, so by making electricity directly from hydrogen through hydrogen turbines or fuel cells, or it can be in direct replacement of systems that need a lot of like transportation fuels. Most transportation fuels can be replaced with hydrogen systems, and the big advantage to that is there's no air pollution. You just have out of the tailpipe of a hydrogen fuel cell train, for example, you're not going to get anything except for pure water. And that's, you know, a new breakthrough because of all the millions of deaths per year from air pollution. So rah hydrogen industry, let's solve this.
So what is kind of the life cycle here from the time that you get the hydrogen to the time that you turn it into something that we can use for energy? Is this a short process? Is this a long process? Do you store it for some period of time? How does this work?
Hydrogen can be quite flexible. So salt cavern storage or other methods similar to natural gas, it can be kept from one season and used in another. It's often cited as one of the good benefits of it, but it's also something that has an element of on-demand use. For example, if you have a whole bunch of wind and solar power generation, for example, in Germany, and the grid is oversupplied, then you can divert a lot of that electricity towards electrolysis devices that make hydrogen, feed it into the natural gas supply grid, which is going on already today in various parts of the world, including Germany. So the versatility, the storability, and also the base load reliability are interesting factors. So one of the things that people highlight correctly is with wind and solar, they're intermittent. The sun is not always shining, the wind is not always blowing. So having the ability to basically create electricity from hydrogen that may have even been originally sourced from that wind and solar is a big advantage.
So could you tell us a little more about what you're doing within oil fields and how that works?
Sure. So when people think about oil and gas industry, they think about what they're really thinking about is we pull hydrocarbons out of the ground, whether it's natural gas or raw crude oil, and we separate them into different types and categories based on, let's say, density is a good proxy. And then those different oil and gas products, hydrocarbon products, go towards receptacles that are specially designed to burn that type of hydrocarbon molecule. For example, diesel and gasoline. You should not put diesel in your gasoline car or gasoline in your diesel car, because it's not designed for that slightly different type of oil to burn. And when I say burn, all I mean is oxidize. So the only thing that an engine or a turbine does is oxidizes certain specific types of hydrocarbons at a given, within a given receptacle that's optimized for that type of hydrocarbon chain. By contrast, we don't need to do all that processing and production of it. We can go to very large existing oil fields and oxidize it in place, which releases, like in an engine, a tremendous amount of thermal energy, expanding gases, which would in an engine go towards driving a piston or something like that. And in our case, this thermal energy is relatively trapped, so it triggers a whole bunch of chemical reactions, many of which give us hydrogen as one of the byproducts. So that saves an enormous amount of steps, refining all of this stuff, because we can just use a downhole filter that only hydrogen can come through and up to surface. Alternatively, we can do separation at surface as well, and re-inject the parts that we don't want, which we can do at relatively low cost because our process starts with an air separation unit. So I mentioned that there's fuel in the ground and there's oxidizer, and the oxidizer within air is 20% oxygen, about 80% nitrogen. And if we don't have to inject all that nitrogen, our process gets much more efficient. So it starts with air separation, which just means cool the air to -185 Celsius, and the oxygen in the air turns into a liquid. And that large scale, that's the easiest way to do fairly high purity oxygen production. And air, of course, is everywhere on the planet. So oxygen is everywhere on the planet. You don't have to transport oxygen a long way to an oil field. If you know where there's a big uneconomic or late life oil deposit, you can just oxidize all that remaining oil in place where it is.
Okay, we have a question here from a listener real quick, Ellen. From Stuart Turley over at the Energy News Beat. Can hydrogen take advantage of natural gas pipelines from the oil and gas fields?
Yes, it can. There are many demonstrations in Canada where this is being done at small scale. But it's something that is more of a regulatory question than a technical question. There is definitely some threshold for every pipeline that's okay, both from a metallurgy versus partial pressure of hydrogen perspective. So if you're in a very high pressure pipeline with bad metallurgy, maybe you can only go a few % hydrogen. If you're in a pipeline that is relatively low pressure or designed for H2S gases, then you can probably go pure hydrogen potentially. It's a case-by-case basis, and the long holdup on that is mainly regulation. I know parts of Europe are targeting up to 20% throughout their whole gas grid, and I think North America's system is probably able to easily go up certainly a few % and then increase it as problems are discovered. And by problems are discovered, I mean have a closer look before we go up to 30% like Hawaii.
Now you said H2S. A lot of the pipelines, I say a decent amount of pipelines out in West Texas and the Permian, there's H2S in those fields already. So those pipelines, if I understand correctly, could handle maybe more hydrogen than something that has no H2S at all. Is that what you're saying?
That's correct. Yes.
And it has to do with the commonalities between the two, between hydrogen and H2S, or what? Just out of curiosity, what's the link there?
H2S requires more of a nickel-rich metallurgy like hydrogen. H2S is also a small molecule, but it carries with it a sulfur atom, and that if that sulfur atom gets into a pipe, it can react with certain types of pipes. So they have a metallurgy that's more specifically does not allow those types of reactions. Whereas if you have what's a sweet gas or something that doesn't have, they call it sweet gas and sour gas. It's an old term. Apologies for that. But there's if you have a sweet gas pipeline, it might have type of metallurgy that either H2S would destroy or hydrogen would find its way into. So hydrogen can, well, it can go, actually, it's such a small molecule that it has the potential to go into a pipeline. And if there's pressure shifts, and where, let's say you have a bunch of hydrogen in a pipeline, and then you shift the pressure to low pressure, some of that hydrogen in the metal can degas. And when that happens, you get spalling and various challenges. There's also metallurgical hydrogen embrittlement, where, you know, just the presence of so much hydrogen within the metal can change the structural integrity of it. So these are things that do need to be examined. Like I say, if you just have a little bit in the mix, it's very likely to not cause any problems to the physical pipelines. But one of the reasons that regulators are reluctant to change the rules is there are certain chemical processes that use pure methane as a feedstock. And it's still not exactly clear how to offset that challenge or ring fence their operation. So if I want to put a meaningful amount of hydrogen into a natural gas stream in Alberta, I have no idea, and neither does anyone else, if that molecule is going to end up in Chicago or California or Vancouver or somewhere else. So it's sort of a whole bunch of regulators talking to regulators about how they all step forward together as people are talking about decarbonization, and it's electrification versus pipelines. So I think there will be a lot of pressure for them to quickly work together to come up with a framework, but it's really hard to say how a lot of conservative pipeline regulators will all talk to each other in an outcome-oriented discussion.
Okay, so let's see here. I have a question, and we also have a comment from a listener. I remember Kinder Morgan talking about this in their investor presentation, moving hydro products with existing natural gas pipelines. Yeah, I was thinking about that when you were talking. I thought Kinder Morgan did have a pretty big field, and maybe they have one in New Mexico as well, if I remember correctly. I don't know. Maybe you might know about that. The other question I had was, when you talk about pipelines, or like oil, especially, you know, heat, really cold, you know, changes how they have to construct the pipelines. How does hydrogen respond to the temperature? So is it, you're up in Canada, I believe, and I'm down here in Texas, and is it kind of operate the same? Was it really cold? Is it really hot, or how does that work?
I believe it's less susceptible to freeze off. So although it's usually desiccated, everything in Canada, we never had natural gas freeze off because everyone builds and designs with sufficient desiccation that you're not going to have a meaningful amount of water vapor in your lines. In Texas, that was not an expectation. So, well, it should have been. You know, if you look back through history, occasionally Texas freezes too. So anyway, that was the big problem, was the amount of water allowed into the system. And you have less of a challenge with that in a hydrogen system, but it still also exists. It's a good idea to try and desiccate your fuel before you send it through. As to Kinder Morgan, I don't know the specifics on that project, but basically, I will say as a general statement, I've been having a lot of conversations with a lot of big pipeline companies, and all of them are thinking about hydrogen blending as a decarbonization method. So many are on the hunt quite actively for large-scale sources of clean hydrogen. And by clean, I mostly mean low carbon intensity in the production. Okay.
Dr. Wald, I'll give you the last question.
Yeah, I was hydrogen has definitely been like a huge buzzword in the energy kind of world today. I know heard a lot from Saudi Arabia about blue hydrogen or green hydrogen, maybe blue ammonia, green hydrogen. Anyway, I was wondering what can you say about you call your process clean hydrogen. Do you think that that's a more realistic way of describing it? And also, what kind of, what are you most excited about for the future of both your company and also hydrogen development?
Well, thanks. Good questions. I think so. First off, I think all these color schemes are a big distraction. If you take something that you can compare apples to apples, by far the easiest is carbon intensity on a life cycle analysis basis. There are standard industrial methods for calculating this, and a long history of it, and it's worked its way into the conversation around border adjustments. So already the EU is starting to do carbon offset border adjustments. So, carbon adjustment. I forget what CBAM is the acronym. So anyway, you take CBAM, where they say, well, your steel has a higher carbon intensity than steel from Sweden. So we're going to offset your steel and charge an extra tariff for you to import it. So there can be a significant quantifiable mechanism for them to justifiably tax imports. And so I think that because it's so simple and easy to do, that will be the predominant method. And it's not going to be just energy. At first, it will be energy and bulk commodities where they calculate the carbon intensity, apply an offset. But eventually, like if you buy an iPhone, it will probably have a sticker on it that says this carbon intensity of this iPhone is, half our competitors' carbon intensity. So therefore, buy this. And I think there's going to be a whole bunch of that making its way into finished products in the course of time because it's such an easy tariff and tax offset. But it also means it's a great opportunity. So if you have methods that are carbon negative, for example, like if you can absorb a whole bunch of carbon from the atmosphere and put it into some sort of a good or product, investing heavily into those today, other companies and governments might be paying, I think will be paying at some point for these carbon intensity offsets versus other places. So that's, to me, a giant opportunity for Proton, because I'll give it a generic example. If we have a 500 ton per day project, our current math projects this, and of course, subject to building it at full scale, but we think that'll require about 6,000 tons a day of oxygen. So if we have 6,000 tons a day of liquid oxygen that we warm up, we can actually get to reasonably easily get to a pressure point where we can passively suck in an additional 12,000 tons a day of CO2 and jam it, co-inject it into the ground. So that helps us for a couple of reasons. One, it dilutes pure oxygen, which is hard to handle, not impossible, but it simplifies our challenge while also sequestering enormous volumes of CO2 at no additional compression costs. So on the one side, we can make replacement fuel and make low cost, low carbon intensity electricity or hydrogen fuel. On the other hand, it can be massively carbon negative. So, if the framework is carbon intensity, I think we're very well positioned to take advantage of that.
Okay, we will let you go with this. It is a tough year for your Flames up there. Any hope for a late season run?
Well, thank you. Very kind.
Okay, well,
thank you so much.
Tell people where they can find out more information about your company.
Oh, www.proton.energy.
Proton.energy. We will link to that in the show notes. And I would wish the Flames the best of luck in this season, but I'm a Blackhawks fan, so it is what it is. But anyways, thank you, Grant, for your time. Best of luck to you guys in the future, and we'll talk soon.
Yeah, thanks for coming on.
My pleasure. Thanks. Bye.
And let's see here, Dr. Wall. There we go. Okay, well, I learned a lot about hydrogen that I can't say the word, which is not my common. I have a small vocabulary. That was interesting. Okay.
Yeah. Well, I think that since it's become such a big kind of buzzword this year, that it's important to understand what exactly we're talking about. And I know a lot of people have been talking about hydrogen fuel cells, and but it's really interesting that I did not know that you can transport it, at least in some of the same pipelines as you would for natural gas, which I think only makes those pipelines more valuable. In a sense.
Well, yeah, and so I knew Kinder Morgan had talked about it, and I want to say maybe Denbury as well has talked about some, but I didn't know enough, and I don't know enough about the metallurgy argument to know how that would play. But if you can use it in the H2S pipelines to some capacity, then there's plenty of those in West Texas and probably other spots as well. But the Eagle Ford, I don't know what the Balkan has. Yeah, they have H2S in the Balkan. Anyways, where those wells are at that you can use some of that. So interesting to see. And something to follow along. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'd like to see. I'd be interested to see if there's more discussion of hydrogen as an energy. In say the progressive left, whatever they call it these days. Energy plans and I know maybe we can't call hydrogen an alternative fuel. I don't really know. I haven't checked on the official status of that, but it would be interesting to see if that can play a role.
It identifies as renewable. So
it identifies as a hydrocarbon. I'd like to identify as, solar power, but we're still working on that. All right.
We're in trouble. Okay, where will you be this week, Ms. Wald?
This week, let's see. Just to let our readers know, last week I was on the Hill. I had an op-ed about an interesting topic that I think not a lot of people are following, but they should, which is the way that Minnesota is trying to adopt California's clean cars regulation through the regulatory process without any actual voting. So unless you want to take California's laws about how many EVs have to be sold in dealerships and apply that to your state, you should kind of be aware that this is happening and this is a real thing, and your state could be next. So check that out. And I will also be on investing.com and Warm Newsletter and Hot Take of the Day.
Okay, and I wrote a piece for Shell Mag about why $60 oil can't save Nigeria, and so talked a little bit about some of the problems there. That is out, and I was on the Run Your Mouth podcast, so with Robbie the Fire Bernstein, talking about the digital yuan, China, and all kinds of stuff along the reserve currency. So if you're of interest to that kind of stuff, Run Your Mouth podcast with Robbie Bernstein. I was on there. So anyways, and I think that's it. We'll be back next week with Dr. Dean Foreman breaking down the API. And we did the quarterly one last, so it's just a monthly. Yeah, it's a monthly statistical report. Looking forward to that. Dr. Wald, everyone, we'll talk to you next week.
Bye.